Well, thank you to Ahmed and GVS and the whole gang here for pulling all this together. I am delighted and honored to be back on stage for the Global Ventures Summit and glad to be down in Los Angeles. I'm going to talk this morning. Actually, they said the title of my speech had something to do with raising capital, and it does. So what I'm going to talk about is at a much higher level than the nitty-gritty of raising capital. What I want to talk about is the larger context of how the innovation ecosystem has evolved over the years. And what I want to talk specifically about is how it has changed and how entrepreneurs, as well as investors and policymakers, need to rethink what they think is the common wisdom about the innovation ecosystem. And what I'm going to suggest to you this morning is that the innovation ecosystem has changed in ways that we haven't quite noticed, but if you want to be successful building a business in the new era, then you've got to pay attention to how it's changed. And I'm going to do that in the context of lessons from Silicon Valley. So the context of this conference is Silicon Valley meets the world. I want to clarify the concept of Silicon Valley for you. So Chris just pointed out, at all costs, do not start a company in Silicon Valley. That was the main point of the last speech. So one of the lessons of Silicon Valley, I guess, is that it's gotten too expensive and too competitive. And so that is definitely an issue. It's definitely an issue. But Silicon Valley is no longer just a geographic place. Silicon Valley is a methodology of innovation. And so when I talk about Silicon Valley, yes, I am speaking somewhat parochially as someone who lives in Silicon Valley. I've been in Silicon Valley for about 30 years. And so I've seen a lot of cycles in Silicon Valley. And hopefully I've learned a lot in terms of what I've seen and how things have changed over the years. So I'm going to talk about lessons from Silicon Valley, though in the larger context of this new type of innovation ecosystem that we have developed over the last, several decades. So with that, in order to get a good understanding of how innovation has changed, I want to do a brief history of innovation. So, Innovation 1.0, click. Innovation 1.0. Innovation 1.0 was the long history of human civilization, right? So going way, way back in time, we invented tools, we built a wall, we built the pyramids, we did, cathedrals, we invented machines, all sorts of things, right? So that's the vast history of human innovation. And then Innovation 2.0, around the 18th and 19th century, we figured out how to harness the power of steam. We figured out how to harness the power of electricity. We discovered things like radio waves. And we had all sorts of amazing inventions in that era, right? Starting with Thomas Newcomen and James Watt invented the steam engine, and then Robert Fulton turned it into the steam ship. And we had Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, and we had McCormick and his Reaper, and then, building up to Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone, and then Thomas Edison invents the light bulb. So we had this era that is generally called the Industrial Revolution, which we learn in the history books from these individual inventors and inventions that changed the world. So that was a pretty amazing time in human history. But then we roll into the 20th century. And in the 20th century, next slide. In the 20th century, innovation became more complex, it became more industrial, it became more expensive. And so we started moving innovation into corporate structures. And corporations started to be the key drivers of innovation. So in this picture here, you see, anybody know? Almost certainly nobody knows the name of the person on the right in this picture. It's a big, big hint there in terms of the machine that he is standing next to. That person is David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff is generally considered to be the guy who was, invented and commercialized television at the Radio Corporation of America. So we saw in the early 20th century, Ford and GM and then IBM and Bell Labs and Westinghouse and RCA started to build these technological, innovative corporations in order to fund the new technologies that were being developed in that period. Then we had the Depression and World War II, and fast forward, the next era is Innovation 4.0. Innovation 4.0 we think of, sort of as the digital revolution, the computer revolution, the information age. And this era was characterized during the period from 1945 to 2008. Next slide. So during this period, from World War II on, we had this unbelievable flourishing of invention. Click. So you look at this list of new technologies that were invented post-World War II. In this era, not only did you have the globalization of corporations, but you had the era of big science. So big science was driven by big government investments in new technologies, which was in turn driven primarily by things like the Cold War. So in this era, from 1945 to the year 2008, we had the most productive era in the history of mankind in terms of new inventions, economic growth, globalization, demographics. We had all of this flourishing of economic development around the world, which was driven by a couple of unique historical factors, right? We came out of the Depression, we came out of World War II, we had to rebuild the world after World War II. We had this demographic explosion. From 45 to 2008, the world population went from about 2.5 billion to over 6.5 billion. More than doubling, almost tripling the population of the world. And we dragged billions of people out of poverty during that era. We had a globalization of education, a globalization of economics. We had an extraordinary era of development. It was a really good time. And that, in fact, is the era in which most of us grew up. Pretty much all of us grew up in that era, right? So there's nobody in the room here who is less than 9 years old. Is that right? Okay. So we all grew up in Innovation 4.0. During this era when the economies were growing fast, the world was growing quickly, it was an amazing era. But things changed in 2008. In 2008, there were two pivotal events. What were the two pivotal events in 2008? Anybody? We had the meltdown, right? The economic crisis, the global financial crisis, whatever you want to call it. So we almost had the end of the Western capitalistic system. We almost had a total meltdown of our banking system. It was unbelievably scary. But the second thing that happened, what was the second thing that happened? The iPhone. The iPhone went global in 2008, and that changed everything. So the good news is we have now seen something in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 billion people on the planet who are integrated into the internet broadly defined, into the communication system and the educational system broadly defined. We still have a few billion people who are left out. So that's the good news. The bad news is we do not have the same drivers of innovation that we had during Innovation 4.0 in the post-war era. We don't have those same drivers. And so we're not going to see a resumption of that kind of growth that we saw in that era. So we've got to do something different in order to get to the same level of expansion and growth that we had in that last era. So that's what I want to talk about now. I want to talk about how we're going to innovate using talking about the top 10 lessons from Silicon Valley. So lesson number 1 has to do with the difference between invention and innovation. And this is something that not too many people have noticed. In the old days, Innovation 4.0, the key was invention. You saw that explosion of inventions. What we have learned in Silicon Valley is that the new way is instead to focus on innovation. So there's a difference between innovation and invention. Thank you. So there's a difference between innovation and invention. And the difference is a little bit subtle. So next slide. You remember all of these inventions I talked about in the post-war era. You look at all of these inventions, and what stands out is that almost none of them came out of Silicon Valley. And you look at all the successful technology companies in Silicon Valley, right? Think of all the successful technology companies in Silicon Valley. How many of them, can you name any successful company in Silicon Valley that was built on its own technology? So certainly not Facebook, certainly not Google, certainly not Apple, certainly not Oracle, certainly not Netflix, certainly not, Can you think of any company that was built on its own technology? I can think of two. The two companies I can think of include Intel. Intel did indeed invent the microprocessor. And Cisco. Cisco actually invented the router. But most successful technology companies in this new era are not built on invention. They're built on innovation. They're built on a model where you take advantage of the inventions elsewhere in the world and in the economy, and you innovate around creating new products and services on top of those inventions. And so when we look for good entrepreneurs, we are looking for innovators, not inventors. Inventors are these people who, they're very easy to identify. They come into your office, and the first words out of their mouths are, I invented something really amazing. It's going to change the world. And what you know about inventors is that their passion is to see the world acknowledging their brilliance for their invention. So an inventor takes his or her invention to the marketplace and says, look at this brilliant new invention. How many do you want to buy? And if the market says, I'm okay, not so much, the inventor's attitude is, they're idiots. They don't appreciate the brilliance, the elegance, the wonder of my invention, right? So an innovator, on the other hand, an innovator is focused on going to the market and saying, look at this solution. Isn't this amazing? This will make your life better. And the market says, not so much. And the innovator says, okay, forget about that. What if I do this, right? So the innovator is dedicated to making the world a better place for his or her customers, not gaining fame for his or her invention. So that's one of the key distinctions in terms of our common wisdom about the innovation ecosystem. It's really about tapping into all the other ideas that are out there and coming up with something novel that will solve a customer's problem. So that's lesson number one. Be an innovator, not an inventor. Lesson number two has to do with the way you build a great team. So typically and historically, everybody is advised, you got to build a balanced team, right? You got to have a balance. You got to have a tech person, you got to have a finance person, you got an operations person, a sales and marketing person, You got to have all of these, different skill sets in your group. And yes, that's true. You got to have different skill sets, but it's not enough. It's not enough. What we've learned is, in fact, what you need to do is you need to build an unbalanced team. An unbalanced team. What do you mean by that, Bill? So, click, click. And one more click. I'm going to explain the unbalanced team in the form of a parable. It's the parable of the optimist, the pessimist, and the engineer. Now, some of you may have heard some of this before, right? So, the optimist. The optimist is the person, if only I had a glass, right? Okay, imagine I have a glass. The optimist is the person who looks at the glass and says, this glass is half full. And the pessimist looks at the same glass and says, nah, this glass is half empty. And the engineer is the person who looks at the same glass and says, this glass was engineered to be twice as big as it needs to be. Ba-dum-bump. Okay, so the point, wow, this is a tough audience. Thank you. So, okay. The point of the story, right? You get the point of the story. The point of the story is the same set of facts, three different perspectives. And the reason you need different perspectives is because you need people who look at the world in different ways than you do. If everybody's an optimist, then you're going to charge blindly into a brick wall as fast as you can, right? You obviously need the optimist, but you also, believe it or not, you need the pessimist. You need someone who's paying attention to how are we going to keep this company going if we don't get that contract, if we don't raise that money, if we don't hire that person. How do we keep it going? So you have someone who is skeptical enough that they're thinking of different pathways. And then you need this third perspective. I call it an engineer. It's probably not an engineer, but the third person, this third perspective is a realist, someone who sees the world for the way the world really is. That is a very rare commodity in startup companies, right? Because you're all drinking the Kool-Aid. It's really hard to understand that, in fact, sometimes customers prefer those crappy competitor products. You know, they must be nuts, right? But you need someone who's going to see the world for the way it really is. So the idea of building an unbalanced team, why do you call this unbalanced? Well, if you have different perspectives in the organization, what happens? You get a lot of conflict. If you have different perspectives, then people start to argue with each other. Now, when I was an entrepreneur, I didn't tell you a lot about my background, but you know, I spent the first chunk of my career as an entrepreneur. I started 4 different software companies in series before we started Garage in 1998, and I became a VC. But when I was an entrepreneur, I thought that whenever people started arguing with each other, it was dysfunctional. It meant something was wrong. And so, you know, I just wanted to tamp down on this argument. This must be bad if people are yelling at each other. And then when I became a VC, we started looking at all these high-performing teams. And I realized that conflict was not the exception. Conflict is the rule in high-performing teams. In high-performing organizations, people are yelling at each other all the time. And I thought, you know, that can't be good, can it? It turns out it's great, it's necessary, it's vital, because if you don't argue, you know, then you're not going to surface all the best possible ideas, and you're not going to figure out the best ways to do things. Now, your job as founder is to figure out how to put in place the culture and the values and the norms and the standards of agreement to turn argument and conflict into advantage, to tap that conflict for its creativity and figure out how to get the best ideas out and how to try things in the right sequence and figure out what works. So it turns out having an unbalanced team, having a team where people are constantly sort of second-guessing and arguing and debating whether things we're doing it the right way, is actually a good thing, as long as you can encompass it in a culture where you disagree and then you commit to doing things together. So that's the second lesson from Silicon Valley. It's not good enough to build a balanced team. You've got to embrace diverse perspectives in your organization and allow for debate. Third lesson has to do with the winning strategy. So traditionally, in America and around the world, we're taught that the key to business success is competing aggressively, right? It's about killing the competition. It's about winning. It's about fighting. It's about, you know, defeating the enemy. That's the metaphor we use in business historically. What is really cool about some of what I've learned in Silicon Valley is some of the best companies are built by winning through collaboration. 10 minutes left, really, okay. By winning through collaboration. So next slide. Some of the best companies, one of the best ways to build a successful company is to build an ecosystem model of collaboration, to build networks among companies, even among competitors, to get multiple companies together, ideally in some platform of some sort, to work together to build an industry, to collaborate, to get new technology adoption, new standards adoption, new sorts of new approaches, new business models that enable all the companies to win. So creating these networks of collaboration is a great way to be successful, and that's one of the things that I've learned from Silicon Valley. Lesson number 4 has to do with the culture of innovative ecosystems. So traditionally in America and around the world, most of our social culture is focused on celebrating celebrities, right? You know, the Taylor Swifts, the politicians, the singers, the athletes, the movie stars, the TV stars. That's how a lot of our social culture is absorbed. The reason Silicon Valley is the way Silicon Valley is because in Silicon Valley, everyone is focused on the same thing, innovation. There was nothing there. There was no culture there prior to the innovation ecosystem. So in Silicon Valley, the focus is on celebrating innovators. And that's an important context for building a successful innovation ecosystem. So it's a challenge down here in Los Angeles. It's a challenge in most communities where you have competing cultures. The big advantage Silicon Valley has had is there was no competing culture. And so everyone was focused on celebrating innovators. And so the difference is instead of, click, so in most parts of America, in most parts of the world, you know, there's 20 times more focus on Taylor Swift than there is on Mark Zuckerberg or on innovators in general. In Silicon Valley, it's reversed, right? In Silicon Valley, there's 20 times more focus on Zuckerberg than there is on Taylor Swift, except maybe for some teenage girls in Silicon Valley. But other than that, I mean, the focus is on celebrating innovators, not on celebrating celebrities. And so as I go around the world, I try to emphasize to the policymakers, to the community organizers, that if you want to build a successful innovation ecosystem, you've got to create a community where innovation is celebrated and where, you know, the young people are oriented towards saying, I don't have to do what is most popular historically. This whole innovation thing is something where I can dedicate my career. Lesson number 5 has to do with your attitude toward failure. So a lot of you have heard this before. In you know, in most of the world, we all grow up with this culture that says failure is not an option, right? Our education system focuses on this. In the education system in the United States and all over the world, the deal is you go to school, you're on your own, you learn the stuff, you take a test, you get a grade, you get a score, you get into college. You do not make mistakes, you may not fail. That's the entire emphasis of our culture. Then you get into the corporate culture, and in the corporate culture, they hire a whole bunch of young people into the bottom of this giant pyramid, and then, you know, see who makes mistakes and who doesn't make mistakes. If you make a mistake, you're fired. If you don't make a mistake, you get promoted. And so in the corporate culture, you keep promoting the people who don't make mistakes. And as a result, you get these cultures where there's absolutely no orientation toward risk or creativity. And that is why corporate cultures are so tough to change. In Silicon Valley, the whole point of Silicon Valley is failure is a necessity. You know, a whole bunch of the people who wind up in Silicon Valley are not necessarily, you know, the A students. They're the students who were sort of the creatives in school, and they were, you know, they tried something different. And so in Silicon Valley, the whole idea is failure is a necessity. It's much more like sports than it is like school. You know, in sports, you got to take a lot of shots. You know, your coaches are always telling you, you got to take the shots. You cannot score if you don't shoot. In school, you don't take a shot unless you know it's right. And so in Silicon Valley, we embrace the culture that says you got to take a lot of shots. And if you're going to take a lot of shots, you're going to have a lot of misses, you're going to have a lot of failures, but that's how you figure things out. Lesson number 6 has to do with the factors of production. Now I'm getting macroeconomic theory on you, right? So we all learn economics in terms of this concept that, you know, when you build economies, over time, the factors of production become more scarce, right? So, you know, raw materials and energy and capital and labor, they become more scarce as you expand your economy. What we've learned in Silicon Valley is thanks to the digital revolution, thanks to our friends who are making computer hardware, thanks to Moore's Law, when you're building something, you assume increasing abundance. not increasing scarcity. And this is very significant around company design, scaling up, and product design. So if you have a mindset of scarcity, then what you're going to do is you're going to build a cheaper Nokia phone, right? Because you figure, I've tapped the rich people, now I got to go down and get the poor people. If you have a mindset of abundance, then you build an insanely expensive iPhone, right? Because you know that over time, it's just going to become more valuable as more people sort of get on the net, as more applications are developed, as the phone becomes increasingly valuable, then you're going to have more of a business. That's how you scale a business, by assuming greater abundance. Lesson number 7 has to do with your R&D strategy. So traditionally, back in Innovation 3.0, when corporations started creating these R&D labs, the big idea was you hire a bunch of PhDs, you hire a whole bunch of smart people, you put them in a room, you close the doors, you close the windows, you don't let them out, and you have them invent, right? So that was the traditional R&D model. What we've learned in Silicon Valley is you have to embrace open innovation. So this was, I give credit to John Chambers at Cisco. I don't know if anybody has actually, somebody's probably done the research on this, but many, many years ago, John Chambers, CEO of Cisco, got together with all of his team and has said, you guys, you're really, really smart. We have some of the smartest people on the planet here at Cisco. But the reality is, not all the smart people on the planet are employed here at Cisco. So if we want to tap all of that brain power, we've got to be open to tapping people outside of Cisco. So they took a whole pile of money away from their internal R&D and they put it into external R&D, or open innovation, investing in startup companies, casting the net broadly for innovators that were developing new technologies in Silicon Valley and around the world. That has now finally, after 30-odd years, has been relatively broadly embraced. Professor at Berkeley coined the term open innovation and has made it acceptable for corporations around the world. As a result, almost every corporation around the world that has any significant technology in their business has now opened an office in Silicon Valley. They've got a lab or an innovation center, and a lot have corporate venture capital centers in Silicon Valley because they all want to get in on this innovation thing. Lesson number 8 has to do with the role of government and universities and industry. Around the world, there's this mindset that we got to use government to jumpstart innovation. And, contrary to popular belief, a lot of people in Silicon Valley say, yeah, well, in Silicon Valley, we don't need government because, we're capitalists and we don't really require that government subsidy stuff. But, we all know historically, government was critical in the success of Silicon Valley, partly through R&D expenditures and partly through military purchases. But so government was key to the success of Silicon Valley. But the story that is not well told is that it's not because of Stanford, it's not because of venture capital that Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley. It's because industry supported startup companies in Silicon Valley. That's the reason Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley. Then venture capital showed up, and then they tapped the universities to sort of build out this ecosystem. But in most parts of the world, what I emphasize to people is you've got to make sure that industry's involved. You've got to get industry willing to participate in the ecosystem. The role of government should be pushed out. That's not a big issue anywhere here in the United States, but there are places where government still dominates around the world in terms of what's driving the entrepreneur ecosystem, and generally that has turned out not to work. There are very few cases where government forcing the innovation ecosystem has worked. Israel, of course, is one example, but that's a very unique historic example. And the other example is, we'll see how the China experiment plays out. So then, lesson number 9 has to do with the globalization of innovation. So one of the big shifts that's happened in just the last few years that we didn't notice was we went from an era where the United States innovated and the rest of the world copied to an era today where now what we're seeing is everybody innovates around the world and everybody copies. So, in Silicon Valley and everywhere in the United States, smart entrepreneurs are casting the net broadly, and they're seeing what's going on in China, what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Russia, and they're copying what other entrepreneurs and other innovators are doing and bringing it into their products and services. And then lesson number 10 has to do with the role of technology. Traditionally, sort of in public policy and historic thinking, we think that technology is what drives innovation. And we have this mindset because of the post-war era where we experienced this explosion of technological invention that literally changed the world. But back to my point about how Silicon Valley is not built on internal invention, what we've learned in Silicon Valley is that people trump technology. And so the best companies understand these precepts of design thinking, the precepts of user experience and customer centricity, that people trump technology. That you have to pay attention to your users, to your customers, to your partners, to your employees. If you don't focus on the people side, it doesn't matter how cool your technology is. So do not think that just because you have a clever technology, you have a successful business. You have to pay attention to people. And then finally, a bonus lesson. I couldn't get it into 10, I had 11. So the bonus lesson has to do with focusing on creating value. So a lot of this ecosystem of venture capital and entrepreneurship seems to be about making money. And clearly that's where the stats and the media and the excitement tends to go. But down where the rubber meets the road, when you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a company, what we've learned is that if you're focused on making money, you're not likely to succeed. In order to win, you have to focus on creating value. Now, a lot of people, their reaction is, oh, Bill, that's one of those nice, fluffy, feel-good things to say. But it really is fundamental. We really can tell the difference when a team walks into our office and they have a clever idea, and they think they can launch a company, and they think they can flip it to Google in a couple of years for, $20 million, and they can make a whole pot of money. We can see these teams that are focused primarily on making money. And what we know is if your focus is on making money, when the going gets tough, when you hit a bump in the road, if it's hard, you're just going to quit and find some other way to make money. But if your focus is on creating value, if your passion is in changing the world and making a dent in the universe, you want to solve this problem and create value for your customers, when the going gets tough, you're just going to figure out a way to get around it. You're going to figure out a way to persist. You're going to figure out a way to build your company. And those are the kinds of companies we want to invest in. Companies that have a passion for creating value for their customers. So, those are the top 10 lessons of Silicon Valley. Click, 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 click through all of them. Focus on innovation, not invention. Embrace diverse teams. Win through collaboration. It's not just about competition. Celebrate your innovators. Don't punish failure. Design for increased abundance. Take advantage of open innovation. Engage industry. Get government out of the way. It's okay to copy. People trump technology, and the bonus lesson, focus on creating value. So, with that, click forward. I want to share with you my email address. If you want a copy of the slides, okay, and this is the advertising portion of the program. So, with that, I don't know if we have any time left, but do we have any questions, any comments, any thoughts, any ideas, any innovations, any brilliant entrepreneurs? Yes. There we go. Yeah.
What are the companies that you're most excited about right now? Just in spaces.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we're most excited about our most recent investment, but which happens to be a company that's doing deep data mining on employee behaviors as a Salesforce automation support technology. But in terms of you know, companies that we're now working on, so I'm always kind of focused on the next thing. You know, we're willing to look, as Garage, we're technology agnostic. So we've decided early on, none of us were going to be smart enough about any sector that it made sense to focus on sectors. And so our big idea was we were going to crowdsource the next big thing, right? We were going to cast the net broadly, literally globally, to try to find brilliant new entrepreneurs with brilliant new technologies. And you know, our other sort of investment thesis is we're looking for some companies that have an unfair advantage in a big particular target area, where they have some extraordinarily compelling value proposition that's not easily copied. And usually that unfair advantage is technological. So we tend to focus on technology. So one of the companies I'm most excited about right now is a spin-out from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. It's a material science play. It's a team. I met these guys, and the founder entrepreneur said, you know, we can print metal parts 100 times faster and 1/10 the price of the current state-of-the-art 3D metal printers. Whoa. I mean, and so what these guys are doing is absolutely mind-boggling, absolutely amazing. So there's still, you know, the challenge is, are they still science, or are they still technology, or are they a company? That's always an issue, you know, when you see something amazing like that. But it's one of the most exciting things I've seen recently. The other thing that I got to tell you is the other most exciting thing I've seen recently is a company out of New Zealand, a company called Soul Machines. And Soul Machines is the brainchild of a professor at the University of Auckland who did all the biomechanics for the computer graphics for the movie Avatar. So he actually won 2 Academy Awards because of his research on human expression. And so what he's figured out is how to create a computer-powered avatar that is emotionally intelligent. So when you're talking to this avatar on the screen, the avatar reflects your emotion, even without words. So the machine is called, the company is called Soul Machines, as I said. And so as soon as the video comes up, it looks at the expression on your face and says, hey, Tom, you're looking tired this morning. How you doing? So their first customer is the Australian Disabilities Insurance Service. And their first avatar is a woman named Nadia. And Nadia happens to be voiced by Cate Blanchett. So they got Cate Blanchett, while she was making a movie, to record a bunch of phonemes. So they recorded all Cate Blanchett's phonemes, and then now they assemble them. They get, you know, a combination of Watson in the back end, natural language processing, and then computer voice creation, assembling her phonemes around a knowledge base to give you an intelligent response that is laden with an emotional intelligence as well. It's really cool. So if you haven't seen, you know, you should go look at Soul Machines, look at the videos, and it's, you know, the future is here, right? So I get really excited about all sorts of technologies, and I could keep going, but any other questions? There's one back there. How do you get me to do what?
How do we get to meet you after this event?
Well, okay. So there's my email. All right. So I'll be honest. So I'm gonna stick around. I will stick around, and I'll try to talk to anybody who wants to talk to me. But here's the deal. Okay. The deal is I'll talk to you. But I want from you 4 things, all right? This is how to talk to a VC, all right? The 4 things you got to do when you talk to a VC. In the first 30 or 40 seconds, you better do 1, make it clear what it is you're doing, what is your business, so that I can understand the business you're in. You know, don't give me a riddle, don't give me a puzzle, don't whatever. I want to know what business you're doing. You know, I need to have a framework to understand what you're saying. So you got to be clear. Second thing, you got to give me something compelling. You can't just say, we have a platform that aggregates this data and provides it to people and blah, 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 right? I don't want to hear about your platform. I want to hear why it's compelling. What is your compelling value proposition? You know, like Surratt Technologies, the Lawrence Livermore, you got to be 100x. You know, that gets my attention. You know, 10x gets my attention. But we're a little better, we're a little faster, we're a little cheaper, right? Okay? So you got to be compelling. That's number 2, right? Number three, you got to be credible. You got to give me some reason to believe that what you're saying is true. What's the evidence that you can pull this off, or that people love what you're doing, that, you know, that you actually have something that does live up to this compelling value proposition? And then number 4, how are you different from all the other entrepreneurs I've heard who are saying pretty much exactly the same thing you're saying? So another insight into the mind of an investor. I didn't realize this when I was an entrepreneur, because when I was an entrepreneur, each company I started, I thought, this is so brilliant, this is so amazing, this is so game-changing. All I have to do is say what I'm doing, and investors will fall at my feet because it was so incredible. And then I became a VC, and then I started listening to hundreds of pitches, and then thousands of pitches, and then tens of thousands of pitches. So, not to mention cell phones. So what you don't appreciate as an entrepreneur is, as soon as you open your mouth, the VC starts thinking to himself or herself, starts thinking, oh yeah, I've heard this before. Who was that team I heard it from? There was a guy and a gal, and they came in, what was the name of that company? And in the back of our brains, we're trying to remember all the other companies that were doing something that sounded exactly like what you say you're doing. And especially when you say, and we're the only ones in the world who can, we go, you know, we may be smiling, but we totally shut down. So you've got to preempt that. You've got to be clear. You know, number 4 is you got to be clear how you're different from all the other companies that say they're doing something that sounds exactly like what you're doing, right? So that's the first 30 or 40 seconds. 4 things: clear, compelling, credible, different. All right? So I'll give you 40 seconds. If you don't hit those 4 things in the first 40 seconds, I'm going to smile and nod and say, I wish you the best of luck. Okay? Is that fair? Okay. Yeah.
Could you quickly comment about the Los Angeles ecosystem to start, compared to your experience in Silicon Valley?
I'm sorry,
Will you quickly comment about the Los Angeles ecosystem?
the Los Angeles ecosystem compared to Silicon Valley. So we've done, you know, a number of investments down here. I used to commute down here very frequently, at least here in San Diego. It has surprised me. It has surprised me that both my brethren, venture capitalists, and, you know, down here locally, that there hasn't been a merging of the ecosystems. I mean, there's some of it, but because you're so close, you would think that we would all have offices down here. We almost opened an office down here during the bubble, but that was the bubble, and everything was crazy during the bubble. But you know, my sense, and I'm going to be unfair to Los Angeles because I just, you know, because obviously I don't know as much as everybody here knows, but I guess I'm just surprised that there hasn't been a deeper, broader, larger venture ecosystem here, venture capital ecosystem here, because there's certainly the brains and the technology. But for some reason, it hasn't localized enough down here. And so generally, there's enough, it's easy enough for entrepreneurs to pop up and for us to pop down that, you know, that there hasn't been a sort of as strong of an indigenous ecosystem as I would have thought. So that's my sense, you know, and yeah, I go around the world and it never occurs to me that, and I never have this experience that, oh, the entrepreneurs here are not as good as the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. So I always have the experience that in every place I go, there are entrepreneurs who are as good as the best entrepreneurs that I come across in Silicon Valley. But But there aren't as many entrepreneurs who have done it many times. There aren't as many entrepreneurs who've got as strong a team and as strong an advisory board and as strong an investment backing. So that's the challenge that Los Angeles has, as well as most other ecosystems, is there's not as much depth. And so the trick is, to the extent that you can get your depth by tapping, the best of the best here, you can get the best of the best here, and or tapping Silicon Valley. You can have the best of all of, Chris's world, where you don't have to pay rent in Silicon Valley, but you can be plugged in to Silicon Valley while still retaining your local network and talent and expense structure. So that's my sense. But I'm sure a bunch of you afterward will jump on me and say, no, Bill, you don't get it. I don't know what's real. Interesting historic irony. So historically, so Silicon Valley is called Silicon Valley because Bill Shockley moved from Bell Labs in New Jersey out to California. And Bill Shockley was one of the inventors of the transistor, of the solid-state transistor. And so he was leaving Bell Labs. He thought he'd come to Silicon Valley and plug into the technology community out here. I mean, he thought he'd come out to California and plug into the technology ecosystem out here. This is now the early 50s. And originally he was going to come to LA. So Shockley was going to set up Shockley Labs in Los Angeles. And at the last minute, he got a letter from a friend of a friend in Northern California who was running an instrumentation company in Palo Alto, who said, hey, don't go to Los Angeles. Come here to Northern California. It's much nicer. And, we would love to have you here, and I need your technology. So this electronics technology company, this instruments company, saw the value of a Bill Shockley and said, I want you here, and I can be a customer for you. And so Bill Shockley diverted, and he wound up coming to Northern California, and the rest is history. So he then hired a whole bunch of guys, including Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore, and who went on to invent the integrated circuit, and then create Fairchild, and then start Intel, and create Silicon Valley. All because, arguably, accident of history, that this businessman, instruments company guy, convinced Shockley to come to Northern California rather than coming to LA. If it weren't for that letter, this would be Silicon Valley. So, okay, anything else? How are we doing? Oh, there he is. Okay. Sorry?
What's your average holding period of investment, and what are your typical exit, and are you often participating on second rounds?
So, we are an institutional venture capital firm, which means, when we invest in a company with the intent to participate in follow-on rounds. So generally, we say our first check is $250 to $500. These days, to be honest, our first check is frequently our first check is $100 to $200, but then we'll double down or we'll triple down into the Series A. We want to participate in the Series A. We want the opportunity to participate in the Series B. We don't want to have to participate in the Series C. So, our thesis is we want to invest in companies that have an unfair advantage, that are not going to require an infinite amount of capital to be successful. Amazingly, I say that, and some number of years ago, people would say, well, Bill, who wants a company that's going to require an infinite amount of capital? And now we're in this era where that's the game, right? The game now is to raise, billions of dollars. It was unimaginable in the olden days, right, that a venture company would raise billions of dollars, from private sources. So it is a different world. So we want to focus on the early stage. Our focus is late seed. We are, of course, a top-tier venture capital firm. Of course, every VC is a top-tier venture capital. So every investment bank is number one. Every VC is top tier. So I should know the statistic off at the tip of my tongue on the average holding period. Amazingly, we've got some great companies in our portfolio that we invested in 2003. So in one of our old funds, and they're great companies, they're big companies, and they're still private. And it's kind of an issue between us and the LPs. The LPs are sort of happy because they're great companies. They're sort of unhappy because it's been a long time. So that's kind of one of the issues inside baseball in the venture capital industry right now, is that the holding periods have become longer and longer and longer, which is actually a good thing, because usually when the holding period is really short, it's because your company's dead, right? not because of an IPO. So,
What is your return on investment that you shoot for?
what we shoot for. So, okay. So this is a model for entrepreneurs to appreciate about the venture capital mindset, which is when you're trying to figure out what's a fair valuation for your company, what goes on in the mind of a VC is, last point, and then I'll quit. Okay. What goes on in the mind of a VC is can I make 10 times my money on this? Now, our metric, we pencil out, can we make 20 times the first check? So can the first check get a 20x return? And then we want to make sure that our Series A all in can get a 10x return. So we're modeling out that if you're valued in such a way that we don't see the way to get to an exit, where after all the dilution, that we can get 10x our Series A, then you're overvalued for us. And to be honest, right now, most every really interesting company we're looking at now is overvalued. So it's really hard. It's really hard right now in the, sort of in the venture industry. It's because there's this bimodal thing going. There's a bunch of hot companies that, once they sort of poke out of the marsh and become hot, then their valuations explode and everybody wants to get in. And we just can't chase those companies. So, we're focused on companies that are the undiscovered hot companies. So that's what we're looking for. So if you're an undiscovered hot company, let us know. And with that, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. I'll see you later.